Some nights do not wake you with noise. They wake you with a feeling that something forgotten has finally decided it can no longer wait. Ethan Carter had lived on the old Pennsylvania farm for almost 3 years, and every evening followed the same comforting rhythm. He checked the fences before sunset, stacked fresh firewood beside the porch, brewed a final cup of black coffee, and watched the last golden light disappear beyond the rolling hills. Ranger, his 7-year-old German shepherd, always rested nearby, stretched across the worn oak floor beside the stone fireplace with the quiet confidence of a dog who believed every corner of the farmhouse was safe. The property itself had belonged to several families before Ethan purchased it after retiring from the United States Marine Corps. The farmhouse had been carefully restored, but the old red barn behind it remained almost untouched. Weathered wooden boards creaked whenever the wind crossed the valley. Rusted horseshoes still hung above the wide sliding doors. Thick ivy climbed one side of the faded structure, while tall grass surrounded its aging foundation. Ethan often planned to renovate it one day, yet something about the barn always encouraged patience rather than urgency. Shortly after midnight, the peaceful silence shattered in a way Ethan had never experienced before. It was not the sharp bark Ranger used when strangers approached the property. It was not the excited growl that accompanied curious wildlife wandering too close to the chicken coop. Instead, it was a long, trembling cry filled with sadness that seemed to rise from somewhere much deeper than fear. Ethan's eyes opened instantly. Years of military service had trained him to wake completely alert, and within seconds he was sitting upright in bed, listening carefully as another heartbreaking cry drifted through the quiet farmhouse. Moonlight spilled across the wooden floor through the bedroom window, casting pale silver shadows that moved gently with the branches outside. Ethan reached for the flashlight resting on the nightstand, but paused before turning it on. Ranger had never made a sound like that before. Never once during thunderstorms. Never during heavy snow. Never when coyotes crossed the fields at night. Another cry echoed through the house. Slower this time. Softer. Yet somehow even more unsettling. Ethan quietly stepped into the hallway. The farmhouse remained completely still except for the old grandfather clock downstairs marking each passing second with steady precision. Tick, tick, tick. The familiar sound suddenly felt much louder than usual. He followed the cries toward the back door, where Ranger stood motionless, staring through the small glass window overlooking the moonlit yard. The German shepherd did not turn around when Ethan approached. His ears remained forward. His breathing stayed calm. Only his eyes reflected an unusual sadness as they remained fixed on one place beyond the darkness. Ethan gently rested a hand upon the thick black and tan fur along Ranger's shoulder. Normally the loyal dog would lean comfortably into his touch. Tonight he barely acknowledged it. Instead, he released one final quiet cry before slowly walking toward the door. Ethan unlocked it without hesitation. Cold autumn air rushed inside, carrying the scent of damp earth, fallen leaves, and old cedar. Ranger stepped onto the porch and paused beneath the pale moonlight. He did not run. He did not search the yard. He simply looked toward the distant red barn, standing silently at the far edge of the property. The weathered building seemed almost untouched beneath the silver glow of the full moon, yet something about its quiet presence felt different tonight. Ranger slowly began walking toward it with measured steps, never once looking away. Ethan followed only a few feet behind, his flashlight still lowered at his side. As they crossed the frost-covered grass, the old barn remained completely silent, but for reasons he could not explain, Ethan felt certain they were not walking toward danger. They were walking toward a secret that had been waiting a very long time to be heard. The old barn seemed to absorb every sound around it, as Ethan Carter and Ranger crossed the frost-covered field beneath the pale glow of the full moon. Even the familiar chorus of crickets had fallen strangely silent. The only sound left was the steady crunch of frozen grass beneath Ethan's boots and the slow, measured breathing of the German shepherd walking several feet ahead. Ranger never hesitated. His ears remained upright, his tail low but relaxed, and his amber eyes stayed fixed on the weathered building standing quietly against the dark Pennsylvania sky. Ethan swept his flashlight across the barn as they approached. Faded red paint peeled from rough wooden boards that had endured decades of changing seasons. Rust covered the heavy iron hinges holding the wide, sliding doors in place. Old farming tools still hung neatly beneath the overhanging roof, exactly where someone had carefully left them years before. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing suggested danger. Yet the strange feeling that had awakened Ethan refused to disappear. Ranger reached the entrance first and stopped. Instead of scratching at the doors or barking, he lowered his head toward the ground, listening. Ethan slowly stepped beside him. The night air carried the familiar scent of dry hay, old pine lumber, cool earth, and distant cedar drifting through the valley. He carefully slid the heavy wooden barn door open just enough to step inside. The old rollers groaned softly after years of little use. Dust floated through the narrow beam of his flashlight, like tiny silver stars suspended in darkness. Inside, everything remained exactly as Ethan remembered. Empty horse stalls lined one wall. A weathered workbench stood beneath a cracked window. Coils of rope hung from sturdy wooden pegs beside shelves filled with rusted horseshoes, old lanterns, and forgotten farming tools. Thick wooden beams stretched high above, supporting a roof that still protected the barn remarkably well despite its age. Ranger entered without hesitation. He walked slowly across the wide plank floor, his paws making gentle hollow sounds against the old timber. Ethan followed quietly, watching every movement. The German shepherd ignored the empty stalls. He ignored the loft ladder and the old tractor resting beneath a canvas cover. Instead, he moved toward the center of the barn, where moonlight slipped through narrow gaps between the roof boards, creating pale stripes across the floor. There he stopped completely. Ethan waited. Ranger remained perfectly still for several long seconds before lowering his nose toward one specific section of the wooden floor. He inhaled slowly, then lifted his head and released another quiet cry. This one was softer than before, filled with something that sounded almost like longing rather than fear. Ethan knelt beside him and carefully examined the old floorboards. At first glance, they appeared no different from the rest. Thick oak planks darkened with age. Scattered straw. Fine layers of dust collecting inside every narrow crack. He gently tapped one board with the handle of his flashlight. A solid wooden sound echoed beneath it. He tapped another nearby. Again, solid. Then he tapped the board directly beneath Ranger's paws. The sound changed instantly. Instead of a heavy thud, a hollow echo rose quietly through the barn before fading into silence. Ethan frowned. He tapped it again. The same empty sound answered from somewhere below. Ranger looked directly at Ethan for the first time since leaving the farmhouse. The German shepherd did not cry again. He simply held Ethan's gaze with calm certainty before lowering one paw onto the same weathered plank as though asking him to listen more carefully. Ethan slowly brushed away decades of dust with his gloved hand. Near one edge of the board, barely visible beneath the dirt, he noticed the outline of old square nails arranged differently from every other plank surrounding it. Someone had lifted this section of floor long ago, then carefully hidden every sign that it had ever been opened. Ethan Carter remained kneeling on the old barn floor while the narrow beam of his flashlight traced every inch of the weathered plank beneath Ranger's steady paw. The hollow sound still echoed faintly in his memory. Years in the Marine Corps had taught him never to rush toward an unanswered question, especially when something had been deliberately concealed. He carefully brushed away more dust with the sleeve of his jacket until the outline of the board became clearer. Unlike the surrounding floorboards, this one showed tiny marks where square nails had once been removed and driven back into place with remarkable care. Whoever had done the work wanted the floor to appear untouched. Ranger quietly stepped backward without taking his eyes from the hidden section of wood. His breathing had become slower. The sorrowful cries that had awakened Ethan only minutes earlier had completely disappeared. The German shepherd now watched in complete silence, almost as though his task had shifted from calling attention to the mystery to patiently waiting for Ethan to understand it. Ethan rose and crossed the barn toward the old workbench where forgotten farming tools rested beneath a blanket of dust. Most were worn beyond use, but hanging from one peg remained a sturdy flat pry bar with only a thin layer of surface rust. He tested its weight before returning to the center of the barn. Moonlight continued slipping through narrow gaps in the roof, mixing with the pale circle cast by his flashlight. The old barn seemed to breathe around them as cool autumn air drifted through cracked wooden walls carrying the scent of aged timber, dry hay, and damp earth rising from beneath the floor. Ethan gently inserted the edge of the pry bar into a narrow seam beside the unusual plank. He applied only enough pressure to test whether the wood would move. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a soft wooden creak, one corner lifted no more than half an inch. Ethan immediately stopped. The board had not been nailed permanently into place. It had been secured carefully so it could someday be opened again. He slowly worked around the edges, loosening the plank little by little rather than forcing it. After several quiet minutes, the entire board lifted free. A cool breath of air rose from the darkness below, carrying the unmistakable smell of old cedar, dry soil, and something preserved for many years. Ethan aimed his flashlight downward. Beneath the floor lay a shallow compartment built neatly between heavy support beams. It was not a natural hollow beneath the barn. Someone had intentionally constructed it with smooth wooden sides reinforced by hand-cut braces that had survived decades without collapsing. Resting at the center of the hidden space sat a rectangular cedar chest wrapped in faded canvas that had once been waterproofed with wax. Dust covered every surface, yet the chest itself remained remarkably well preserved. Thick leather straps crossed its lid, held closed by a simple brass buckle darkened with age. There were no locks, no warning signs, no indication that anyone had expected to hide it forever. Ranger slowly approached the opening and quietly lowered his head. He did not paw at the chest. He did not bark. Instead, he gently touched the edge of the cedar box with his nose before looking back at Ethan. His amber eyes no longer reflected sadness. They carried something closer to quiet relief. Ethan carefully climbed into the shallow compartment, lifted the surprisingly solid cedar chest with both hands, and set it gently upon the barn floor. As loose dust drifted into the moonlight, he noticed something carved into the lid beneath years of faded wax. The letters were still clear enough to read. To whoever finds this, please protect what is inside before you judge why it was hidden. For several long moments, Ethan Carter simply stared at the cedar chest resting upon the weathered barn floor. The carved message lingered in his mind with unexpected weight. It did not sound like the words of someone hiding stolen property or burying shame. It sounded like a person asking for understanding long after they were gone. Ranger quietly settled beside the chest, folding his front legs beneath him while keeping his eyes fixed upon it. The German shepherd appeared completely calm now. Whatever sadness had drawn him across the moonlit field had given way to a peaceful stillness that Ethan had never witnessed before. He brushed another thin layer of dust from the lid and carefully released the aged brass buckle. The leather straps, though worn with time, remained surprisingly strong. Whoever had prepared the chest had chosen quality materials meant to survive for generations. Ethan slowly lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar became stronger as cool air escaped from inside the carefully sealed container. Resting neatly at the top lay a folded canvas cloth protecting everything beneath. He gently peeled it back and immediately recognized a familiar object. A pair of military dog tags rested on top of a carefully folded American flag, preserved with remarkable care despite the passing years. Ethan instinctively removed his baseball cap and lowered his head for a brief, silent moment of respect. Beneath the folded flag lay a bronze star medal inside its original presentation case. Next to it rested several faded family photographs protected inside clear waterproof sleeves. One picture showed a smiling veteran standing outside the very same red barn decades earlier beside his wife, a young daughter no older than 6, and an older German shepherd wearing a worn leather collar. Ethan studied the photograph closely. The barn looked newer then. Fresh paint covered the walls. Flower boxes rested beneath the windows. Laughter seemed frozen forever inside that single image. Ranger leaned forward and quietly sniffed the photograph before looking toward Ethan once again. Deeper inside the chest rested a thick leather journal wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Beside it lay a sealed envelope with elegant handwriting still perfectly readable across the front. It simply read, "For my daughter, if life ever brings you home." Ethan swallowed slowly. The words settled heavily inside the quiet barn. Whoever had hidden this chest had never stopped believing someone would eventually return. He gently placed the unopened envelope beside the journal, careful not to disturb its fragile paper. At the bottom of the chest rested one final object unlike everything else above it. It was an old property deed folded neatly inside another waterproof sleeve together with a hand-drawn map of the farm. Several small pencil notes surrounded the sketch, pointing toward places Ethan recognized immediately. The farmhouse, the creek behind the pasture, the large oak tree near the eastern fence. Everything had been labeled with remarkable precision. Yet one small sentence written beneath the drawing captured Ethan's complete attention. It read, "If this chest has finally been opened, please ask Samuel Whitaker what really happened before anyone tells my story." Ethan quietly repeated the unfamiliar name under his breath. Ranger suddenly lifted his head toward the eastern wall of the barn as though he recognized something in the silence beyond. Outside, the first faint song of an early morning bird drifted across the valley. Night had begun surrendering to dawn. Ethan carefully closed the cedar chest once more, knowing instinctively that whatever truth had remained hidden beneath these old floorboards for decades had only just begun to reveal itself. The first light of dawn slowly spread across the Pennsylvania Valley as Ethan Carter carried the cedar chest from the old barn into the farmhouse. Ranger walked quietly beside him, no longer looking back toward the weathered building. The strange urgency that had filled the night seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a calm patience that Ethan could not explain. He placed the chest carefully upon the sturdy oak kitchen table where warm morning sunlight streamed through the windows, revealing every scratch and faded mark carved into the old cedar. Fresh coffee filled the room with its familiar aroma, yet Ethan barely noticed it. His attention remained fixed upon the journal resting beside the unopened letter addressed to a daughter who might never have known it existed. Ranger settled near the fireplace, watching every movement without making a sound. Ethan washed the dust from his hands before returning to the table. Respect mattered. Whatever story rested inside these pages belonged to someone who had trusted the future more than the present. He slowly unfolded the oilcloth protecting the leather journal. The cover showed years of careful use, softened by countless hands, and preserved remarkably well by the dry cedar chest. Inside the front cover, written neatly in dark blue ink, appeared a name for the first time: Thomas Whitaker. Beneath it, another sentence had been carefully added: "If these pages survive longer than I do, please let my family know that hope never left this farm." Ethan quietly turned the first page. The earliest entries described ordinary life on the property many years earlier. Thomas wrote about repairing fences before winter arrived, planting apple trees with his young daughter, and watching their loyal German shepherd chase butterflies across the pasture while his wife laughed from the farmhouse porch. Every page carried gratitude rather than complaint. The farm had clearly been more than land. It had been home. Several pages later, the journal described Thomas returning from military service, determined to rebuild a peaceful life. He wrote about long mornings restoring the barn by hand, replacing damaged beams, painting the walls bright red, and teaching his daughter how to care for the horses. Ethan smiled faintly as he realized the weathered barn he now owned had once echoed with laughter instead of silence. Then the tone of the journal slowly changed. Thomas described difficult financial years that forced many neighboring farms to close. He worried that selling family heirlooms would erase part of their history forever. Instead, he decided to preserve every meaningful possession inside the cedar chest until life became stable again. One journal entry stopped Ethan completely. It had been written only days before the chest was hidden beneath the barn floor. Thomas explained that his daughter had moved away with relatives after his wife became seriously ill, believing she would return once everything settled. He refused to mail the final letter because he wanted to place it directly into her hands himself. "If I cannot keep that promise," he wrote, "perhaps someone kinder than fate will." Ethan slowly closed his eyes. The room remained silent except for the gentle ticking of the old kitchen clock. Ranger quietly rose from the fireplace and rested his head against Ethan's knee. The German shepherd did not need to understand the words written inside the journal. Somehow he seemed to understand the weight they carried. Ethan reached down and gently stroked the thick fur along Ranger's neck before opening the journal again. Near the final pages, Thomas had written one last request beneath a carefully drawn map of the farm. "Please find Samuel Whitaker before you decide what becomes of this story. He remembers everything that I could never write." By late morning, the autumn sun had burned away the last traces of mist drifting across the fields, But Ethan Carter could not shake the feeling that the journal had placed a responsibility into his hands rather than simply revealing a forgotten story. Ranger stayed unusually close as Ethan drove the old pickup truck along a narrow county road lined with maple trees whose leaves glowed shades of gold and crimson beneath the clear Pennsylvania sky. The folded map from the cedar chest rested safely inside the journal on the passenger seat, while the sealed letter remained protected in a small canvas bag beside it. According to several longtime neighbors, Samuel Whitaker still lived less than 12 miles away on the edge of the valley, quietly spending his retirement in the farmhouse where he had grown up. Ethan turned onto a gravel driveway bordered by split-rail fences and neatly trimmed hedges before stopping beside a modest white farmhouse surrounded by tall oak trees. Ranger stepped calmly from the truck and waited beside the front porch without pulling ahead. Before Ethan could knock, the front door slowly opened. An elderly man with silver hair, kind blue eyes, and a weathered face shaped by years of honest work stood quietly in the doorway. He leaned lightly upon a polished wooden cane, yet there was remarkable strength in the way he carried himself. Samuel studied Ethan for a long moment before his eyes settled upon Ranger. A gentle smile slowly appeared. He knelt with surprising care and extended one hand toward the German shepherd. Ranger approached without hesitation, lowered his head, and accepted the greeting with complete trust. Samuel's smile faded into thoughtful silence. "It has been many years since I looked into the eyes of a shepherd that reminded me so much of another one," he said softly. Ethan introduced himself and carefully explained how the previous night had unfolded, describing Ranger's unusual cries, the hidden compartment beneath the barn floor, and the cedar chest preserved beneath the old wooden planks. Samuel listened without interrupting. The moment Ethan quietly spoke the name Thomas Whitaker, the elderly man's shoulders became still. He slowly closed his eyes before taking a long, steady breath. Without saying another word, he invited Ethan inside. The living room walls displayed photographs collected across an entire lifetime. Farming seasons, military reunions, family gatherings. Near the fireplace stood one framed picture that immediately captured Ethan's attention. It showed two young brothers standing shoulder to shoulder beside the very same red barn many decades earlier. One of them wore the familiar Bronze Star medal that now rested safely inside Ethan's cedar chest. Samuel followed Ethan's gaze and nodded quietly. "Thomas was my younger brother," he said. His voice carried sadness, but no bitterness. People believed he abandoned everything when hard times came. They never knew he spent his final years protecting the memories he feared would disappear forever. Ethan carefully placed the leather journal upon the coffee table. Samuel rested both hands gently on its worn cover without opening it. His fingertips lingered there as though greeting an old friend after many silent years. Ranger quietly settled at Samuel's feet, his calm amber eyes never leaving the elderly man. Samuel smiled through tears that never quite fell. "I wondered all these years if someone would finally find what he left behind," he whispered. "I simply never imagined a faithful German shepherd would be the one to bring his promise home." The afternoon sun drifted slowly across the windows of Samuel Whitaker's farmhouse as silence settled comfortably between 3 generations of loyalty, one carried by memory, one by service, and one by quiet instinct. Samuel finally opened the leather journal with hands that trembled only slightly, not from age alone, but from the weight of years that had passed without answers. Ranger rested peacefully beside his chair, occasionally lifting his head whenever Samuel softly smiled at another familiar page. Ethan watched without interrupting. Some reunions deserved the dignity of silence before words could find their place. Samuel turned to one of the final entries and nodded gently. "This is where everything changed," he whispered. He explained that after Thomas's wife passed away following a long illness, grief settled over the farm like an endless winter. Money became scarce, neighbors quietly moved away, and Thomas feared losing the property that had belonged to the family for generations. When distant relatives offered to care for his young daughter while he rebuilt the farm, Thomas accepted with the promise that they would soon be together again. Life, however, unfolded differently. A severe economic downturn forced the farm into foreclosure proceedings before Thomas could recover financially. Believing strangers would scatter every treasured possession connected to his family, he gathered the journal, military honors, photographs, property records, and the unfinished letter into the cedar chest. He built the hidden compartment beneath the barn floor with his own hands, hoping he would return for everything after rebuilding his life elsewhere. Samuel lowered his eyes before continuing. He never abandoned his family. He simply ran out of time. Ethan listened quietly as the truth settled into place with heartbreaking clarity. For decades, many people had believed Thomas disappeared because he wanted to leave his responsibilities behind. The journal revealed something entirely different. Every decision had been driven by love, dignity, and hope rather than escape. Samuel carefully unfolded an old newspaper clipping tucked between two journal pages. The faded article announced the sale of the Whitaker farm many years earlier. Beneath the headline, someone had written a single sentence in blue ink. "Someday my daughter will know I never stopped coming home in my heart." Samuel smiled sadly. "I never showed anyone this because nobody wanted another story. They wanted an explanation that fit their assumptions." Ethan glanced toward the sealed envelope still resting safely inside the canvas bag. "Do you know where his daughter lives now?" he asked quietly. Samuel nodded after a thoughtful pause. "Emily Whitaker lives in Vermont. We exchanged Christmas cards for several years after she became an adult, but eventually life carried us in different directions. I still have her last address." Hope entered the room as naturally as the afternoon sunlight. Samuel carefully walked to an old writing desk beneath the front window and removed a small wooden box filled with neatly organized letters tied together using faded blue ribbon. After several minutes, he found the most recent envelope. The address remained legible. Ethan accepted it with both hands, understanding that he was no longer carrying only a forgotten chest or an old journal. He was carrying the final promise of a father who had trusted that kindness would eventually find what time had hidden. Ranger slowly stood and walked toward the front door. He looked back once at Ethan, then toward the peaceful valley outside where golden leaves drifted across the fields. For the first time since that mysterious midnight cry, Ethan understood that the journey had never been about discovering what lay beneath the old barn. It had always been about finding the person who had been waiting, without even knowing it, for someone to finally bring her father home. 3 days later, the Pennsylvania hills welcomed a gentle autumn rain that washed the last traces of summer dust from the winding country roads. Ethan Carter stood on the farmhouse porch watching the quiet drizzle fall across the fields while Ranger rested beside him, his calm amber eyes fixed on the gravel driveway leading toward the property. Since returning from Samuel Whitaker's home, Ethan had carefully contacted Emily Whitaker using the address Samuel had preserved for so many years. He had explained only enough to encourage her to visit in person, believing that some stories deserved to be discovered with one's own eyes rather than through a telephone call. Shortly after noon, the distant sound of tires rolling slowly across wet gravel echoed through the valley. A dark blue sport utility vehicle appeared beyond the maple trees before coming to a gentle stop near the old red barn. A woman in her early 50s stepped out carrying only a light rain jacket and an expression filled equally with uncertainty and quiet hope. She paused for several moments, looking toward the weathered farmhouse, then toward the familiar barn that existed only in the earliest memories of her childhood. Ranger quietly rose and walked toward her with slow, respectful steps. He did not bark. He did not rush forward. He simply stopped several feet away and gently wagged his tail. Emily smiled through eyes already beginning to fill with tears. "You remind me so much of Duke," she whispered, kneeling carefully to greet the German shepherd. Ranger lowered his head into her waiting hands as though recognizing a sorrow that had traveled many years before reaching this quiet farm again. Ethan welcomed her warmly before guiding her inside the farmhouse where the cedar chest rested upon the oak table exactly as it had been found. Sunlight filtered softly through the kitchen windows as rain continued tapping gently against the glass. Emily stopped breathing for a brief moment when she saw the folded American flag resting beside the bronze star medal. Her trembling fingertips moved slowly across the presentation case before she lifted one faded family photograph from its protective sleeve. A quiet laugh escaped through her tears. "I remember this day," she whispered. "My mother had planted sunflowers beside the porch, and my father spent all afternoon teaching Duke to carry my red baseball glove back to me." Ethan quietly handed her the sealed envelope bearing her name in Thomas Whitaker's careful handwriting. She stared at it for a long time without opening it. Decades had passed since anyone had spoken to her in her father's own hand. Finally, with remarkable care, she broke the aged seal and unfolded the letter. The room became completely silent except for the soft rain outside. Emily read each line slowly, sometimes smiling, sometimes closing her eyes as though hearing her father's voice once again. The letter carried no excuses, no bitterness, only love, encouragement, and an unwavering promise that not one day had passed without him hoping they would stand together on the farm again. When she reached the final sentence, she pressed the letter gently against her heart. "He never stopped believing I would come home," she said quietly. Samuel, who had arrived only minutes earlier, rested one comforting hand upon her shoulder. Ranger moved closer and lay peacefully at her feet. Ethan looked toward the old barn through the rain-covered window and realized that the hidden compartment beneath its weathered floor had never been built to protect medals or photographs alone. It had preserved a father's final chance to tell his daughter that love can survive even when time seems determined to bury it forever. The following Saturday, the rain clouds gave way to a clear blue sky, and the Whitaker farm welcomed more visitors than it had seen in decades. Word had quietly spread through the valley, not through gossip, but through neighbors speaking with genuine respect about the remarkable discovery hidden beneath the old barn floor. Ethan Carter never sought attention, yet he understood that Thomas Whitaker's story no longer belonged inside a cedar chest. It belonged to everyone who had unknowingly carried the wrong version of the past for far too long. Folding chairs were arranged beneath the broad maple trees beside the barn, where soft autumn sunlight filtered through golden leaves drifting gently onto the grass. Local veterans, longtime farmers, church members, teachers, and families gathered together with quiet curiosity. Samuel Whitaker stood beside Emily near the old barn doors, while Ranger rested calmly at Ethan's feet, his amber eyes peacefully observing the growing crowd. The German shepherd appeared completely relaxed, as though he already knew his part in the journey had been fulfilled. Ethan carefully placed the leather journal upon a simple wooden table beside the folded American flag, the bronze star medal, the preserved family photographs, and the sealed property documents that had finally returned to the family they belonged to. He spoke softly, never raising his voice above the peaceful sounds of the countryside. He explained how one unusual night had led Ranger toward the forgotten compartment beneath the barn, and how every discovery afterward had revealed not scandal, but devotion. Samuel then stepped forward carrying the old newspaper clipping that had shaped public opinion for so many years. He gently held it beside one page from Thomas's journal. The difference between the two stories was impossible to ignore. One had been built upon assumptions made during difficult times. The other had been written by a father who never stopped believing his daughter would someday return home. Emily quietly unfolded the letter once more. Her voice trembled slightly as she read several passages aloud. Thomas wrote about hope, forgiveness, and the simple dream of hearing laughter fill the farmhouse again one day. He never blamed anyone. He never complained about hardship. Every sentence reflected gratitude for the family he loved more than any possession hidden inside the cedar chest. When Emily finished reading, complete silence settled over the gathering. Many people lowered their eyes, reflecting upon how easily unfinished stories can become permanent misunderstandings. After several moments, one elderly neighbor slowly stood. He admitted that years earlier he had repeated rumors about Thomas without ever knowing the truth. Another longtime resident quietly shared similar regret. No one defended the old assumptions. Instead, people chose honesty over pride. Ethan watched as understanding quietly replaced decades of misunderstanding, not through argument, but through compassion. A local history teacher approached Emily with a respectful request to preserve copies of the journal for the County Historical Society so future generations would remember the true story. Emily smiled warmly and agreed, explaining that her father had hidden the chest to protect memories, not to bury them forever. Ranger calmly walked toward the barn entrance and sat exactly above the place where the hidden compartment remained beneath the restored floorboards. Sunlight surrounded him as children quietly gathered nearby, gently petting his thick black and tan fur while listening to the remarkable story that had begun with one mysterious midnight cry. Ethan looked across the peaceful faces filling the farmyard and realized that the greatest discovery beneath the old barn had never been the metal, the journal, or the photographs. It had been the chance for an entire community to replace judgment with understanding before another generation inherited a story that was never true. The weeks that followed transformed the old Whitaker farm in quiet ways that no one could have predicted. Autumn slowly gave way to early winter, and each crisp morning painted the fields with a thin layer of silver frost that sparkled beneath the rising sun. Ethan Carter continued his familiar routines, repairing fences, splitting firewood, and caring for the property with the same steady discipline that had guided him throughout his years of military service. Yet one place had changed forever. The weathered red barn was no longer simply an aging building standing at the edge of the pasture. It had become a place where memories were treated with the same respect as living people. The hidden compartment beneath the restored floorboards remained carefully preserved, covered once again by the original oak plank after being reinforced from below to protect it for generations to come. Rather than removing its history, Ethan believed the barn should continue telling it. Emily Whitaker returned often from Vermont during the following months. Each visit seemed to lift another invisible weight from her heart. Together she and Samuel sorted through the photographs, journals, letters, and military keepsakes, preserving every document inside archival sleeves before donating carefully scanned copies to the local historical society while keeping the originals safely within the family. One Saturday morning, they placed a handcrafted wooden bench beneath the large maple tree facing the barn doors. A small brass plaque rested quietly upon its backrest. It carried only one simple sentence. "Love remembered always finds its way home." No names appeared beneath the inscription. None were needed. Ranger accompanied every visitor who walked across the property. Children naturally gravitated toward the gentle German shepherd, who greeted every stranger with calm dignity instead of excitement. Local veterans often knelt beside him before entering the barn, quietly running their hands through his thick black and tan fur while sharing stories that had remained unspoken for many years. Somehow the peaceful atmosphere encouraged honesty without demanding it. Ethan noticed something else that quietly amazed him. Since the night Ranger first cried beneath the moonlight, the faithful dog had never returned to the center of the barn floor or paused above the hidden compartment again. Whenever they entered together, Ranger simply walked beside Ethan with relaxed confidence, his ears loose, his breathing slow, and his eyes free from the mysterious sadness that had first drawn them there. It was as though the silent promise that had rested beneath those floorboards had finally been fulfilled. One cold afternoon, Samuel stood alone inside the barn while pale winter sunlight filtered through narrow gaps between the wooden boards. Ethan found him resting one hand upon the restored floor where the cedar chest had once been hidden. Samuel smiled softly without looking up. "For years I believed my brother left behind only questions," he said quietly. "Now I understand that he left behind an answer. He simply trusted the future to deliver it." Ethan looked across the peaceful barn, where beams of warm light illuminated floating dust that danced gently through the still air. He realized that history is not always rescued by grand discoveries or famous names. Sometimes it survives because one loyal dog refuses to ignore a quiet calling that no one else can hear. Outside, Ranger waited patiently beneath the maple tree, watching snowflakes begin drifting across the valley with calm amber eyes. Ethan stepped into the winter air and walked toward him. Together they stood facing the old barn for several silent moments before turning back toward the farmhouse, leaving behind a place that no longer carried the weight of forgotten sorrow, but instead welcomed every sunrise with quiet gratitude and enduring peace. Winter settled comfortably across the Pennsylvania countryside, covering the rolling hills with quiet mornings of frost and clear blue skies that seemed to stretch forever above the valley. Nearly 3 months had passed since the hidden cedar chest had changed so many lives, yet the greatest transformation could not be measured by restored documents or preserved family keepsakes. It could be seen in the people who now found reasons to gather where silence had once lived. Every Saturday afternoon, the old Whitaker barn welcomed neighbors, local veterans, school children, and travelers who had heard about the remarkable story carried home by one faithful German shepherd. Ethan Carter never turned the farm into a museum. He wanted it to remain exactly what Thomas Whitaker had always hoped it would be, a home where kindness could continue growing instead of becoming trapped inside the past. The restored barn smelled once again of clean pine lumber, fresh hay, and cedar instead of forgotten dust. Warm sunlight poured through the high windows, illuminating carefully preserved photographs displayed inside handcrafted wooden cases built by volunteers from the community. The original journal rested safely inside climate-controlled protection, while beautifully reproduced pages allowed visitors to read Thomas's words without risking damage to the precious original. The folded American flag and Bronze Star medal remained beside the family photographs exactly as they had been discovered, quietly reminding everyone that courage sometimes continues long after service has ended. Ranger greeted every visitor with the same gentle dignity that had first guided Ethan across the moonlit field. Children often sat beside him while listening to Samuel or Emily share stories about the Whitaker family, and the German shepherd accepted every gentle touch with patient calm. Ethan occasionally smiled as he noticed people speaking more softly whenever Ranger entered the room, almost as though they understood they were standing beside the quiet hero who had made the entire reunion possible. One bright Saturday morning, a school bus arrived carrying a group of middle school students studying local history. Their teacher explained that history often appears inside textbooks, but sometimes the most meaningful lessons remain hidden until ordinary people choose compassion over assumptions. The students listened carefully while Emily described her father's unwavering hope, and Samuel explained how easily incomplete stories can become accepted as truth. At the end of the visit, one young boy quietly approached Ethan. He looked toward Ranger before asking a simple question. How did he know where to look? Ethan smiled gently before resting one hand upon the German shepherd's broad shoulder. I do not know, he answered honestly. Maybe loyalty remembers things that people sometimes forget. The boy nodded thoughtfully before kneeling to gently stroke Ranger's thick black and tan fur. That quiet conversation lingered in Ethan's thoughts long after the visitors had departed. As evening settled across the valley, he walked with Ranger toward the old maple tree where the memorial bench overlooked the peaceful barn. Fresh snow rested lightly upon its wooden seat, while the small brass plaque reflected the fading colors of sunset. Samuel and Emily joined them carrying steaming cups of hot cider. None of them spoke for several minutes. They simply watched golden light slowly disappear beyond the hills while smoke drifted gently from the farmhouse chimney into the calm winter sky. Ranger rested comfortably between them, closing his eyes for a brief moment before leaning softly against Ethan's leg. The mysterious sadness that had once echoed through the midnight darkness had completely vanished. In its place remained something far stronger than answers alone. The farm had become living proof that truth uncovered with patience, shared with humility, and received with compassion has the remarkable power to heal not only one family, but every heart willing to listen. By the time spring returned to the Pennsylvania Valley, the old Whitaker farm no longer felt like a place carrying the weight of unfinished memories. Gentle rain awakened the pastures, wildflowers slowly returned along the fence lines, and fresh green leaves unfolded across the great maple trees surrounding the farmhouse. Birds built new nests beneath the barn roof, while warm morning sunlight filled every corner that had once stood quietly forgotten. Ethan Carter often paused before beginning his daily chores, simply listening to the peaceful sounds that now surrounded the property. The farm had not changed because new buildings had appeared or expensive renovations had transformed the land. It had changed because truth had finally found a home where misunderstanding had lived for decades. Ranger continued following Ethan through every ordinary morning, exactly as he always had. They repaired gates, checked fences, carried feed across the pasture, and welcomed visitors who arrived seeking more than a local history lesson. Some came because they had served in the military and understood the importance of unfinished promises. Others arrived carrying old family stories they had never questioned until hearing Thomas Whitaker's remarkable journey. Ethan noticed that conversations on the porch often lasted much longer than anyone expected. People began sharing forgotten letters discovered in attic boxes, faded photographs hidden inside family Bibles, and quiet regrets that had remained unspoken for years. Somehow the peaceful farm encouraged honesty without asking for it. Emily Whitaker gradually spent more time in Pennsylvania than in Vermont. One bright Saturday, she quietly announced her decision to restore the small orchard her parents had planted decades earlier. Together she, Ethan, Samuel, and several neighbors cleared fallen branches, repaired broken stone borders, and planted young apple trees beside those that had somehow survived the passing years. Ranger wandered peacefully among them, occasionally stopping beneath one particular tree where Thomas had once photographed his young daughter laughing beside their first German shepherd. Ethan often watched the loyal dog resting there in warm afternoon sunlight, wondering if certain places somehow remember kindness long after the people who created it are gone. Samuel smiled whenever he noticed Ranger choosing that familiar spot. Perhaps some memories never truly disappear, he said softly. They simply wait for someone willing to notice them again. One afternoon, a family arrived carrying a rescued German shepherd adopted only weeks earlier from a local shelter. The shy young dog hesitated before entering the barn, uncertain of unfamiliar surroundings. Ranger approached slowly with quiet confidence, lowering his head and greeting the younger dog with remarkable patience. Within minutes, both dogs walked comfortably together across the wooden floor while the children laughed nearby. Ethan looked toward Emily, who smiled through grateful eyes. "My father would have loved seeing this," she whispered. Ethan believed she was right. The barn that had once protected a hidden promise had now become a place where new beginnings quietly unfolded every season. As the sun settled beyond the western hills, Ethan and Ranger followed the familiar path back toward the farmhouse. They paused briefly beneath the maple tree where the memorial bench overlooked the peaceful barn, glowing warmly beneath the evening sky. Fresh blossoms drifted gently through the soft breeze, landing upon the grass with effortless grace. Ranger sat quietly beside Ethan, his amber eyes calm, his breathing steady, his heart finally at peace. Ethan rested one hand upon the faithful German shepherd's shoulder and smiled toward the old red barn. It no longer held secrets beneath its floor. Instead, it carried something far more enduring. It stood as gentle proof that when loyalty refuses to give up, hope eventually finds the courage to step out of the darkness and walk home into the light. 1 year later, the old Whitaker farm welcomed another quiet autumn morning, and the valley seemed to breathe with the same peaceful rhythm that had carried it through every changing season. Golden sunlight stretched gently across the fields while a cool breeze carried the scent of fresh hay, cedar, and fallen maple leaves through the open windows of the farmhouse. Ethan Carter stepped onto the porch with a warm cup of black coffee resting comfortably in his hands. Ranger followed only a moment later, his black and tan coat glowing beneath the early morning light, his amber eyes calm, steady, and completely free from the sadness that had awakened them both on that unforgettable night. Together they looked across the familiar landscape where the restored red barn stood proudly beyond the pasture, no longer surrounded by silence, but by quiet purpose. The orchard Emily Whitaker had replanted now displayed rows of healthy young apple trees preparing for another harvest. Families visited almost every weekend. Children laughed while exploring the walking trails. Local veterans gathered beneath the maple tree to share stories, and rescued German shepherds occasionally arrived with new owners beginning hopeful chapters of their own. The farm had become something no one had planned, yet everyone somehow needed. Ethan slowly walked toward the memorial bench beneath the great maple tree where Samuel Whitaker already sat enjoying the peaceful morning. Emily arrived carrying a basket filled with fresh apples gathered from the young orchard, smiling as she watched sunlight dance across the weathered barn walls. Ranger greeted both of them with one gentle wag of his tail before lying comfortably beneath the bench. No words were necessary. The quiet itself carried gratitude. Samuel looked toward the old barn and softly laughed. "Your brother would probably tell us we worried far too much," Emily said with a warm smile. Samuel nodded. He would also remind us that home is never measured by buildings. It is measured by the people who choose to return. Ethan quietly looked toward Ranger before reaching down to gently stroke the thick fur along the faithful German shepherd's neck. The memory of that first mysterious midnight cry remained clear, yet it no longer felt unsettling. It had become the beginning of a journey that restored a family's history, healed a community's misunderstanding, and reminded one veteran that some of life's greatest missions arrive without warning and ask only for compassion instead of certainty. As the afternoon passed, visitors slowly arrived carrying flowers, handwritten notes, and photographs to place inside the small remembrance display created beside the barn. Some had never met Thomas Whitaker. Others had never known his family. Yet each person paused with quiet respect before continuing through the peaceful farm. Ranger calmly greeted every guest exactly as he always had, accepting gentle smiles and kind hands before returning faithfully to Ethan's side. As evening settled across the valley, the final rays of sunlight painted the barn with deep shades of gold and amber, while hundreds of autumn leaves drifted softly through the cooling air. Ethan and Ranger followed the familiar path back toward the farmhouse, their footsteps moving together with the easy rhythm shared only by companions who had traveled every season. Side by side, halfway across the field, Ranger paused for a single moment and glanced toward the old barn one last time. He did not cry. He did not hesitate. He simply wagged his tail with quiet contentment before continuing beside Ethan toward the warm light glowing from the farmhouse windows. Behind them, the peaceful barn stood exactly where it had always been, but its greatest treasure no longer rested beneath the floorboards. It lived within every heart that now understood the quiet truth one faithful German shepherd had refused to let the world forget, proving that even the deepest memories can find their way home when loyalty walks patiently beside hope.